Hi, my name is Atticus. I'm a master's student at Naropa University studying contemplative psychotherapy and Buddhist psychology. And my presentation today is on psychedelics and gender identity. And I'm going to talk about welcoming brilliant sanity in psychedelic-assisted therapy. So my presentation is going to start with a kind of guided personal reflection or contemplation. And this is absolutely optional. You can decide whether you want to engage or not. And this is true as I continue through this contemplation, and it'll be over when I get to the next slide. But if you choose to engage, I invite you to first kind of settle in, contact yourself sitting or standing, wherever you are, and to reflect on some moment that you felt spaciousness, some moment that you felt, vastness. You could have been lying in a meadow, sitting in the forest, swimming in the ocean, any experience that connects you to vastness. And just to contact that, see what that's like. And now to notice your breathing. No need to change your breathing, just noticing it as it is. Welcoming any experience that arises as you're breathing. Maybe you meet it with this too, or yes. Can you trust that any experience that's arising is okay? This too. This too. Now I'm going to end the contemplation with a question, a reflection on clarity. Just reflecting on why you're here. What brought you to listen to this talk? Do you have any expectations for this presentation? And once again, can you meet anything that arises with acceptance, this too, or yes? And on the next out breath, just let the whole thing go. And I will transition to my first slide of content. Thank you for your contemplation. I'm going to start by talking about the view of contemplative psychotherapy. What is contemplative psychotherapy? It's the integration of contemplative practice or contemplative philosophy, in this case, specifically Buddhism, and Western psychotherapy, particularly the humanistic school. In contemplative psychotherapy, the core teaching is of brilliant sanity. And brilliant sanity is seen as the true nature of mind, which is clear, it's luminous, or it's vibrant, and it's compassionate. For any Buddhist scholars, the term basic goodness, Buddha nature, Tathagata Garbha, we're talking about the same thing when I say brilliant sanity. And brilliant sanity is always showing itself, no matter how confused the mind appears in any experience. It's really at the root because it's the true nature of one's mind in this view. So this inherent wakefulness of brilliant sanity, it can be pointed to, it can be recognized, and it can be encouraged in a therapeutic relationship with a psychotherapist who is interested and curious about one's brilliant sanity. Another aspect of contemplative psychotherapy is unconditional friendliness, because every state of mind is viewed as fundamentally workable, no matter how confused it looks. At the root, there's really brilliant sanity, the way this is viewed. So with that, anything that arises out of experience can be met with friendliness. And really this teaching of brilliant sanity and the view of Buddhist psychology revolves around the notion of a self. The view is that oneself we're constantly in a creation project, where we view ourselves as permanent. There's something unchanging about us. As solid, there's some boundary that we're able to find, to easily define, that says who we are. And separate. In addition to that boundary, there are things that are outside of oneself. There are things that are considered, not part of myself. And this construction project with these three facets, it's considered fundamentally untrue. And the function of this project is to avoid recognizing one's own brilliant sanity. So the role of a contemplative psychotherapist is to point, to recognize brilliant sanity whenever it arises. And it particularly arises when things fall apart, when this construction project has a gap, when something's changed in someone's life, there's some shock. Then it might be easiest for a contemplative psychotherapist to point to brilliant sanity. And I also want to mention that this view of brilliant sanity is the opposite of needing to break through to get to brilliant sanity, because the view is that it's actually inherent in any experience that's coming up. So it can actually be found in psychopathology or in regular waking life and waking actions, in addition to areas where it might be more easily pointed to. So this construction project, once again, is important to hold in kindness, because at the root, it's brilliantly sane. And I'm going to present a couple quotes about contemplative psychotherapy and about this view of the self that I'm talking about. Firstly, I'm going to quote Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who was the first person to coin the term contemplative psychotherapy. Chogyam Trungpa said that what Buddhism really has to teach the Western psychologist is how to relate more closely with their own experience in its fullness, its freshness, and its immediacy. To do this, one doesn't have to become a Buddhist, but one does have to practice meditation, because the more you learn about your own mind, the more you learn about other people's minds. And that last part is really a root teaching of contemplative psychotherapy, something I'm going to come back to many times during this talk. Now from the Buddha himself. The Buddha, when speaking about himself and speaking about his analysis of the self, he said, "This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself." The Buddha went on further to say, "Whatever is not yours, abandon it." So what you see in this quote is really a core aspect of Buddhism, is investigating the self to really find out what's going on here, what's going on in this construction project. And this really ties in well to psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted therapy. MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. They are the organization that has basically brought MDMA through the FDA trial process. They're currently in phase 3, the last phase of trials before possible approval of MDMA for use in psychotherapy. And their treatment philosophy is outlined in quite a lengthy treatment manual. And the core of it is this idea of the inner healing intelligence, this view that one actually possesses within themselves the innate wisdom, the innate capacity to grow and heal. The MDMA is there in the session. It helps kind of allow the inner healing intelligence to flourish. And the psychotherapist is there to hold the space and ensure that everything's going fine, kind of, controlling the situation a little bit by having boundaries. But really the participant, the person, is the source of their own healing because they possess inner healing intelligence. The way this is described in the manual is that a tree always grows towards the sun. It's the tree's natural inclination. So what you might or might not be recognizing at this point are some parallels between this idea of inner healing intelligence and my presentation of brilliant sanity. I view them as the same thing. Either way, there's some natural experience, some natural knowing in oneself that can be found and pointed to and is the source of radical healing, radical change. And in the MAPS manual, there's a warning, and it's a pretty strong warning, that the therapist's inner work is absolutely crucial to be able to go in any direction that the client wants to go. There's a warning that otherwise an agenda might be imposed. If a therapist isn't comfortable themselves in going somewhere a client wants to go, a therapist might redirect the session. So this is where kind of unconditional friendliness and brilliant sanity, the trust in a clinician's experience, becomes really important. Because psychedelic therapy creates a situation where brilliant sanity can be found by partially and temporarily disrupting this fixed, solid, separate notion of a self. If you recall, I explained that the function of this really fixed, solid, separate self is to avoid recognizing brilliant sanity. So when MDMA is taken, that's kind of partially disrupted. So the therapist's job is really to point, to kind of notice it, smell it out, and show it to the client. And this relates, I think, really strongly to experiences that someone might have in changes, fluidity in their gender identity. I'll start with the definition of transgender, simply from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. Trans means to be across, through, on the other side of, or beyond notions of gender. So this could include someone who identified as, or was given the identification as a woman at birth, and then transitions to identify as a man. It could also include other identities of people who consider themselves both a woman and a man, or neither. They could be agender, non-binary. So I'm including really a wide net in the definition of transgender here. But what's important is that in a psychedelic therapy session, as I mentioned, these kind of permanent, solid, separate notions of a self might have a crack. They might fall apart a little bit or a lot. And specifically, how one relates to their gender might be challenged. This notion of oneself as having a permanent gender, that might change. The gender being solid, being able to put a box around it. If someone feels they've gone beyond gender or outside of it, that might also change. And separate, that might also be challenged if someone sees gender identity and something that they've been given as something that had social construction. Not that all of these might happen, but these are all possible. So the notion of a fixed, solid, separate self might be clearly disrupted in some scenarios where someone might be going through psychedelic-assisted therapy. And because this is being disrupted, naturally, it's a manifestation of brilliant sanity. Naturally, brilliant sanity might be able to be pointed to when this idea of oneself falls apart. So once again, it's really important to cultivate unconditional friendliness towards whatever experience arises. Someone might also not want to investigate this when it appears. That might also be rooted in brilliant sanity, some knowing that there might not be safety to explore this. So that's why any experience can really be trusted. On the left, you see a picture of Tara Brach. Tara Brach is an influential American Buddhist meditation teacher, practitioner, a clinical psychologist, and a cisgender woman. And in a book about transgender identity and Buddhism, Tara writes that there is a luminous, vibrant, flowing, empty world beyond the dualism that fragments reality. Something that I think is powerful from Tara's words isn't only the fact that this disruption is a manifestation of brilliant sanity, but also that it can inform anyone's gender identity. Anyone, regardless of whether they identify as transgender or not, can experience some liminality, some fluidity, some change in a psychedelic experience. And this is itself brilliantly sane. Also, I could have chosen a lot of examples to illustrate the need to trust and have conviction in brilliant sanity, to have conviction in the inner healing intelligence. But it's really important at this specific time that we talk about transgender and gender identity as it relates to psychedelic therapy. One of the reasons is because of a political kind of cultural situation that's happening specifically in the United States, where transgender rights are being curtailed and limited through legal legislative practices. And that this mindset has the potential to enter the psychedelic therapy space. Actually, I think that it's almost guaranteed to enter the psychedelic therapy space. So this is really important to watch because that can be very harmful to someone if a therapist were to, change direction in a session away from someone's experience that they're having. Another reason that this is important is because the only piece of published research that exists that talks about fluidity and gender identity and psychedelics together is a case study that sees someone's fluidity in gender identity, in this case, someone wanted to transition, as something that was caused by a life of addiction and something that was triggered by LSD. And in this specific case study, again, the only study published, the study encouraged treatment using antipsychotics to, and what treatment meant in this case was to bring someone back to identifying with the gender that they were assigned at birth. And this might be very harmful for someone grappling with uncertainty and identity, to kind of impose frankly, an agenda on what they should do, who they should be. So a takeaway from this, I think the key takeaway, is that the clinician's view impacts the therapeutic process, especially in psychedelic therapy. The clinician's experience is incredibly important, both in contemplative psychotherapy's view in general, and through the MAPS treatment philosophy used for psychedelic-assisted therapy. When I talked about not having a solid sense of self, not having a solid, true self, actually, the implication is that there's an exchange that can take place. When someone takes MDMA or takes a different psychedelic, depending on the psychedelic, but in general, someone's experience becomes more fluid. A term that's used is suggestibility. So people's boundaries become more permeable. The therapist might actually feel the experience that a client might be having in a therapy session. So not only is this experience happening in a client, but it might be happening within the therapist. What this means is that the therapist needs comfortability in anything that arises within them. And they have to start with themselves. As you might recall, this is a key facet of the MAPS treatment approach. The therapist needs to do their own inner work. And this inner work really could have to do with all kinds of topics. It could be with addressing sexual trauma. It could have to do with physical trauma, or it could have to do with some uncertainty, some fluidity in identity. The therapist, if someone is coming in with fluidity in their gender identity, a therapist in psychedelic-assisted therapy needs some level of comfortability in working with that within themselves. But this is a tall order. How can a therapist really practice being able to deal with anything that is inside of them, any experience that they feel? No therapist is going to be perfect at this, but I think the gateway to being able to trust that anything that arises can be worked with is some conviction in brilliant sanity, some conviction in the inner healing intelligence. That has to be done by viewing one's own experience, investigating one's experience, and seeing that anything arises comes from brilliance. And because of that, everything has workability. Everything is workable. So I'm going to move, as we approach the end of the talk, into a reflective contemplation that, again, you can choose to engage with or not, absolutely your choice. But if you choose to, I'm going to ask you to start by reflecting on some recent situation in which either you experienced pain or someone else experienced pain or suffering, and you wanted to alleviate it. You wanted that to go away. What does that feel like, that wanting pain, wanting suffering to go away? Now I invite you to contact your breath. And on the in-breath, you can touch your pain or touch someone else's pain or suffering, whatever situation that was that you were thinking of. Just touch it, say this too. And then on the out-breath, let it go into a more spacious container, a bigger container. Maybe the moment of spaciousness you contacted at the beginning of the talk. So breathe in, touch it, let it go. Any experience is okay. And on the next out breath, let the whole thing go. And this concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.